Introduction. All around. All around. The new magazine. New story, half-fabled, near-legendary magazine of the teens. It began in November 1910 as the New Magazine, became New Story in August 1911, and experienced one more title change to All Around in December 1915, before combining with another Street and Smith pulp, People's Magazine, in April 1917. New Story was an exciting and robust magazine. In 1913 it succeeded in obtaining the second novel of the immensely popular Tarzan series by Edgar Rice Burroughs in direct competition with the All Story, the monthly magazine that had published Tarzan of the Apes in October 1912. The Return of Tarzan was published as a 7-part serial beginning in June 1913. A month after it had ended, another Burroughs serial, historical and heroic, The Outlaw of Torn, began in the January 1914 issue. It was in good company, for the popular English novelist H. Rider Haggard was represented with Allan and the Holy Flower at the same time. By the time the title had changed to All Around in December of 1915, the magazine was basically one of fantastic and swashbuckling adventure, and it is easy to believe that the instantaneous and startling success achieved by Edgar Rice Burroughs beginning in 1912 was influential in the pattern of stories adopted by the magazine. Indeed, Burroughs was represented in the February 1916 issue with Beyond 30, a fantastic which loomed as near unobtainable for a period approaching 50 years. Other inclusions were in the same vein. Robert Ames Bennett, who had written the popular THYI at the turn of the century, was represented with a fine serial, The Bowl of Ball. This is set in the far reaches of Arabia during World War I, and it involves a lost race, some fearsome creatures, and enough high adventure to satisfy the most avid reader. The Buddha's Elephant appeared in the August 1916 issue from the pen of prolific H. Bedford Jones, writing under the name of Alan Hawkwood. It is a tale of an ancient Greek city surviving in the Gobi. George B. Rodney's fantastic The Underground Trail appeared in the last, March 1917, issue of All Around. It was good enough to be published in book form as Beyond the Range, and, even in 1970, it remains an attractive book to the science fantasy collector. The Treasure of Atlantis appeared complete in one issue in December 1916. It reflected some of the news and theories of the day with its Crete Atlantis theme, and in many ways allies itself with the 1970 thinking which holds that Cretan civilization was destroyed by volcanic eruption. As early as 1909, Atlantis had been identified with Crete in some archaeological circles, and the belief was popular in the teens. But the theory behind the Treasure of Atlantis is unimportant. It is enough to say that this story was written to entertain, to quench the interest and appetite of the armchair adventurer. There is little doubt that the Treasure of Atlantis was written for the same audience that had made the Burroughs stories popular. Morse, its hero, is strong and silent, and despite his position of wealth and influence in a world of more than 50 years ago, he is unhappy with civilization. His partner in exploration, the great archaeologist, is a character that is part Burroughs, part Haggard, with more than a little of Conan Doyle's famous Professor Challenger about him. The Treasure of Atlantis combines the lore of the unknown, the grandeur of the fabled past, and savage, swashbuckling action. As such, it is a fitting novel for the Time Lost series. Chapter 1. The Flowing Road. It's good to be back again, Morse, back to civilization, and it's mighty good of you to take me in this way. Stanley Morse looked at the orchid hunter as the latter leaned forward from the cozy depth of the stulbag chair and stretched his lean hands to the blaze. The fingers were more like claws than human attributes, the whole man seemed little more than a well-preserved mummy, a strangely different person from the vigorous naturalist Morse remembered meeting 3 years before on the higher reaches of the Amazon, the flowing road. The man's clothes hung in ludicrous folds about his gaunt frame, and he shivered despite the heat of the blazing logs that almost scorched his chair. "Nonsense, Murdock," he said. "I'm only trying to repay your own hospitality. Do you suppose I have forgotten the time you took me into camp on the Walagos River, when my raft had gone to pieces in the Chapaja Rapids with all my equipment. You've got the malaria in your system yet. Let me get you something to offset that ague. It's more than malaria, Morse. There's nothing in your medicine chest, or anyone else's, that can help me. He laughed a little hysterically and stripped back the sleeve from one arm. The limb, save for its power of movement, seemed atrophied. Flesh and muscle and skin had shrunk about the bones until they looked like two sticks held together with twisted cords. That's emblematic of the rest of me, he said, as the loose cloth slid back over his knobby wrist. I've done my last league on the flowing road, or any other road, for that matter. I've found my last orchid. You'll be all right with a few weeks' rest, replied Morse, with forced optimism. As for the financial end of it, we can build a bridge across that stream. I need no man's charity, said Murdock, with a flash of fierce resentment. If you'll put me up for a while, it won't be long, as you have offered to. I'll accept it gladly, but I can pay my way, Morse. That's all right, answered Morse, sensing the feverish excitement of his guest. We'll not talk of payment. Tell me about your trip, if you feel up to it. And join me in a hot toddy. He touched a bell, and a deft manservant answered, retiring to bring in the necessary concomitants. This beats chapter, said Murdock, as he sipped the steaming liquid. And this, his eyes roved round the big room, the walls set with well-filled bookcases that reached half their height, the spaces above covered with curios and trophies of the chase. Mostly South American. This is a long way from Ukali's hut on the headwaters of the Xinca. He lapsed into a reverie, staring into the fire, his skull-like head sunk between his hands, as if he could see in the glowing coals the seething cataracts of a torrent racing between rugged sandstone palisades clothed with dense forests, where the lianas writhed between the trees and bound them together in an almost impenetrable jungle. Stanley Morse, gentleman adventurer, who spent his bountiful income in the exploration of unknown lands for the sheer love of sport and the thrill of danger, watched his guest pityingly. There were hardly 10 years between them, he reflected, remembering the man of 3 years ago, bronzed and lusty, barely entering the prime of life. Now he seemed 60, twice Morse's own age, and prematurely old at that. Presently he relapsed with a long sigh, finished his toddy, and settled back amid the cushions luxuriantly. The headwaters of the Xinca. That was where you came out? Morse queried. Don't talk if you are too tired. Let it go until tomorrow, and turn in. There may be no tomorrow, answered the orchid hunter. There was nothing morbid in his tone. He spoke cheerfully, as one who recognizes overpowering odds and accepts them bravely. So I shall talk tonight. Yes, that is where I came out of the Carrasco brush, alone. But the story I want to tell you begins back of that, on the Chapadao plateau, between the Xinca and the Manuel, south of Para, in Mato Grosso state. He turned his head, with its dark eyes glowing in deep hollows sunk in the skin that looked like brown parchment, and spoke in a low tone fraught with impressiveness. Did you know, Morse, he queried, that there was a great city on the southern part of the Amazonian plateau? It hardly surprises me, said Morse. I've never seen any evidences in Brazil myself, but I made a trip to Chinchan, in Peru, near Trujillo. Pre-Inca they call it. Not much left but a honeycomb of mud walls now, though. Mud walls? Pish. I'm not talking of ruins, man. I mean a living city. Temples cut from the living rock, great buildings of stone set along the shore of a mighty lake amid tropical foliage and cultivated fields. Paved roadways, and people thronging them clad in brilliant garments. Boats on the lake, with banks of oars and striped sails. A city set in a bowl of grey cliffs in the shadow of a snow-capped peak with a plume of smoke coming from it like the curl of a lazy fire. You've seen it? Twice. He spoke with conviction, and Morse for a moment shared the vision. The next sentence shattered it. Twice in the air. Don't think I'm crazy, Morse. It was a mirage, but even a fata morgana has to be projected from an actual object. And there's tangible proof to back it up. They were not air castles I saw, not the airy segments of a dream. Morse tried to veil his growing skepticism. The orchid hunter was Scotch, and the gales, he reflected, were apt to be fae and sea visions. The man was physically and probably mentally sick. But he humoured him. A mirage is an optical effect rather than an optical illusion, I believe, he said. Undoubtedly there was some solid basis for the reflection. Are you sure about the smoke above the peak? It was my impression that Brazil was free from disturbances. It's a long time since I read up anything about it, but I seem to remember that there were no eruptive features since the Devonian period, according to the scientists. A fig for the scientists. Let the scientists travel a country instead of theorizing about it. Show me the scientist who has hacked his way through 12 miles of Carrasco and charted the lower Amazonian chapadões. I lay no claim to being a scientist. I know one branch of botany, but I know it well, and I know enough of geology in that connection to tell a crystalline formation from an amorphous. The valleys of the Madeira, Tapajós, Manuel, and Xinca are flawed with crystalline. And the rest of the formations are tilted and faulty. In 15 years I've known a third as many temblors, earthquakes, and I know a volcano when I see one. Twice I saw it, across the canyon, the temples by the lake, the snow-capped cone, and the plume of vapor. Twice. Again he focused his attention on the burning logs, speaking as if the fiery recesses were focal points through which he viewed the strange sights of the land that is bordered by the flowering road, the mighty Amazon. You know, without my telling you, the general characteristics of the Chapadão region, said Murdock. The main plateaus at an average level of 3,000 feet, but up by the streams and rivers intersections, dense forests in the lowlands, woodlands in the shallower valleys, and the grassy campos on the heights. It seemed as if misfortune trailed us. Our bogadors deserted us, the cargadors were a lazy crowd, reports of rare blossoms turned out myths, hardly a week occurred without some accident, common enough, save when they happened so frequently. I had started late, owing to difficulties brought up by the European War, going up the Amazon 870 miles from Para to Itacoatiara and so up the Madeira River 660-odd miles to San Antonio Falls. From there I had to traverse and raft it to the small pebble rapid, Guajaramerim, they call it, and it was hard work. I was after a cycnoches, a weird, night-blooming orchid that looks, by moonlight, exactly like a great azure butterfly. It was worth $5,000 to me for every fertile capsule I could bring out, and I stayed longer than I should. It was the middle of September before I started on the 450-mile trek that's as the parallel rulers mark it on the map to the Alto Tapajós, with another 400 miles downriver through almost continuous rapids to really navigable water to Marajó Grande. It was foolhardy to stay that long, but it looked like my last trip with a fortune at the end, and I found my orchid. Then the luck turned. Definitely. Our stores were low, and we hurried along, half-fed, in an attempt to forestall the rainy season. You know what that means, a difference of 40 feet in the rivers, making them all but impassable. I never met with such a mat or jungle, lianas fighting us every foot of the way, and the gnats, flies, and beetles, to say nothing of the vampire bats and leeches, draining our strength and impregnating us with their poisons. I had a young chap named Gordon with me. I left him behind, poor fellow. He was a clever naturalist and a plucky comrade. We staggered on, delirious from insect venom often, the whole trip seems a nightmare and, after crossing the Jania, the ill luck culminated. We came across a settlement where the native chief was sick, and we were called upon to cure him, a common enough occurrence, but one that landed us this time on the horns of a dilemma. The man was dying, due to pass out in 48 hours or less, from enteric fever. You can imagine the situation. Fail to treat him, or treat him and fail. It made you either a beneficent wizard or a devil. I did the best I could, and kept him alive a week. He was grateful enough, poor wretch, but there were ugly looks as we left the pueblo, and I knew the news would be sent ahead by the jungle wireless. The hollow logs hung on lianas that they beat with a stick coated with rubber. As we advanced, I had evidence of increasing hostility. We had dogs with us, and they constantly warned us of lurking enemies. We extinguished all fires and buried the embers before dark, and all smoking was stopped after nightfall while we kept constant watch. We caught the sound of drums one afternoon, first in one direction, then in another, and I knew we were trapped. The cowardly cargadors started to pick up their packs and flee, but I made them stop, and we felled trees for a barricade. Well, they attacked just before dawn, and poor Gordon was hit with an arrow tipped with urari. We beat them off that time, and pressed on, with Gordon in a litter. He lasted 3 days, with his arm swollen up twice the size of his thigh, and passed out in coma. 4 times different bands tried to leave us in the jungle, and each time I lost 2 or 3 of the cargadors through flight that undoubtedly cost them their lives. The last time an arrow scratched me, passing under my arm through my shirt. I put leeches on the wound and took strychnine, but I was a doomed man from that moment. My heart failed me at every exertion and the poison was absorbed inevitably into my system. We shook them off at last, and 2 weeks later we crossed a campo of dried grass and came to a great cut in the plateau eroded by a stream that ran in rapids 500 feet below. I made camp there, hoping to gain strength. It was the next morning I saw the mirage. Not I alone, but the half-dozen carriers still left with me. It was as I told you, plain in the sky, temples, buildings, lake, boats, and the crowded causeways. I had practically no fever that morning. The cargadors prostrated themselves in terror. That afternoon they left, taking their packs with them while I was having my siesta. My 2 machete men stayed behind, not from any particular fidelity, but, as they expressed it, we were bound to be killed, anyway, and they might as well stay where they were comfortable and meet death rather than try and run away. You may imagine it was not a cheerful situation. I was on my last legs in the heart of the Brazilian jungle, the rainy season close at hand, practically all my supplies gone, without bearers. It was a tight hole. To crown the trouble, the cargadors had taken along my orchids in their scurry. There was nothing to do but to make the best of it, and that meant getting underway. My rifles and ammunition were in the shelter, and one of the dogs had stayed behind. There was no use crossing the stream, for the opposing cliffs were sheer and apparently unscalable, though I thought I saw traces of a succession of rough steps that almost looked like masonry leading to a ledge halfway up the cliff. But there they ended definitely in a smooth wall. So I decided to follow the stream downward. It ran almost due northeast toward the Amazon, and I hoped that later it would widen and become navigable for a raft. Shorthand as we were, that was a slim chance, but the only one in sight. It was useless to follow the carriers. The day was drawing to a close, and I determined to pass the night where we were. At sunset I heard a shout from the machete men, and found them groveling on the edge of the precipice. It was the mirage again, floating in a sky of pale green. It was no hallucination, Morse. I was not the only one to see it, and if ever a man had braced himself for an emergency I was in that condition. I found that the Indians considered it a sure sign of death, a vision of their heaven, I imagine. But the 2 who stayed with me were real men. We struck out early next morning. The plateau sloped sharply downward, and in 2 hours we were clear of the grass and brush and among trees and jungle once more, following a fairly well-beaten trail. About a mile in, the dog got restless, and we advanced cautiously. Suddenly the hound, which was ahead, began to whimper. He was trained not to bay or howl, and stood still. I crept up to him. The trail widened out. Swinging face downward in the center of the opening, his outstretched fingers a foot clear of the ground, a man hung, one leg caught in the running loop of a rope that was attached to a springy palm, the noose trap that the Indians set for tapirs in the river runways. But this was not a tapir trail. The man had evidently hung there for a long time. The free leg swayed limp, the body was relaxed, and the face, as it swung toward us, was congested. There was a red fillet about his hair that proclaimed him a chieftain, the alcalde of some pueblo. We had him down in a jiffy. I could send help to ourselves from his gratitude if he wasn't dead. We worked over him feverishly, and presently he groaned and opened his eyes, and then his mouth, down which I poured some chacta that helped him to tell his story. His name was Tagua, chief of a tribe inhabiting the village of Apra. He was an old man, but still too fond of life to suit his nephew who wanted his place. This precious relative had set the trap and then told Tagua that he had seen a tatu, armadillo, on the trail, knowing the old man would travel 10 miles to get its flesh. That was the day before. Tagua walked into the trap in the afternoon, and was jerked up in a second. It was fortunate for him that no peccaries came that way, or a jaguar. None of the villagers did. His nephew looked out for that. When we had kneaded and rubbed Tagua's joints into place and pliancy, his gratitude knew no bounds. He knew all about us by the wireless drums, and volunteered to send back a message that would leave us immune. He may have given up the information that we were murdered. When we marched into Apra, Tagua managing to put up a front for the entry, we created a sensation. Mbata, the nephew, had already usurped the leadership, but he was quickly convinced of his mistaken ambition. After a big feast, Tagua put me up in his own hut, and that night I solidly cemented the friendship. Mbata paid us a visit about 3 o'clock with a big knife calculated to sever all friendly relations. I woke as he came in, and dropped him with a revolver bullet as he leaned over Tagua, knife in hand. After that I owned the village. I had not only saved Tagua's life, but snuffed out that of the one man he was afraid of. He gave me 10 of his pisonos, villagers, 4 of them boatmen and 6 carriers, and all the yuca, dried fish, and bananas we wanted. More than that, he sent out scouts for my missing carriers, but they failed to find any trace of them. I left him my hound and Paul Gordon's rifle, with a good supply of cartridges, and he forthwith adopted me. It was not all form, as I will show you. The night before we left, I spoke of the mirage and Tagua confirmed its existence. It was known to his people as Dor, and its inhabitants were not Indians, but men whose skins were white as mine. Long generations before, his people had been used as slaves over a period of years. When the work was complete they had been driven out through a hole in the cliff at the head of the masonry steps I thought I had seen, and the place closed up after them. His own great-great-great-grandfather had been among the captive workmen, and when he left he had stolen a vase from the house of his bondlord. This vase had long been a fetish in Tagua's family. It was one of the things Mbata had desired. But Tagua had hidden it cunningly in the floor of his hut, and Mbata had been unsuccessful. It had been a bad fetish, he declared, and to my astonishment, seriously gave it as his opinion that stolen goods never brought good fortune. So he insisted on my taking it. And it was gold. He said that twice a year the people of Dor threw many vessels and ornaments of gold and jewels into their lake for sacrifices. The city was sealed in by cliffs that could not be climbed, but it was rich in metal. Gold was used for ornaments, for plates, for drinking cups. Whatever his imagination though, the vase attested that he told at least some measure of truth. I took it. We got to the Xinca in the rains, and to Para. And the vase is here. I brought it with me. Chapter 2. The Vase of Minos. Long after the orchid hunter had gone to bed, Morse held the vase in his hands, turning it over and over while the ruddy firelight played upon the repoussed surface, speculating upon its history. Had he known what the cup held for him of perilous adventure upon the very rim of death, it is possible that he would have resisted the spell it gradually wound about him. It was untarnished and undented, despite the softness of the beaten surface of unalloyed metal, and it was of the most exquisite workmanship. Finally he set it upon the table beneath the glow of his lamp. The vase was an oval container, exquisitely symmetrical, supported by 4 serpents of solid gold whose heads met with forked tongues touching beneath the center of the bowl. Its main surface was divided into 2 panels by the duplicated design of a double axe. On one side a superbly modeled bull was being baited by a youth and a maid, clad in garments apparently Grecian. The figures were lithe in action, beautiful in pose. Darts clung to the snorting, wounded bull that pawed the ground with lowered head. The other panel was filled with ancient writings above which, in raised letters, was the word Minos that Morse easily deciphered, though the characters were ancient Greek. Here was a riddle, a golden vase brought back from the heart of Brazil, yet eminently Grecian. He turned to his bookshelves, the word Minos stirring his recollections. Far into the night he read of the great Minoan dynasty established on the Isle of Crete, in the Mediterranean, of its wonderful empire and powerful fleet, houses that possessed ventilating and sanitary systems far ahead of their time, and of the civilization that produced both pictorial and linear writing 2,000 years beyond Phoenician culture, for long credited as leader in such matters. He read of Minos, the sun god, son of Zeus, and of his wife, Pasiphae, the all-shining moon goddess, of the cruel sports in the Minoan bull rings, the tragic death of Minos, killed by a king's daughter, who poured boiling water over him in a bath. Of Minos' children, Daedalus and Ariadne, noted names of Greek mythology. Of the victims tortured by being enclosed in the belly of a red-hot brazen bull, and of the invasion of the kingdom of Crete 2,000 years before Christ, and its final destruction, 400 years later, in the Dorian conquest, by the rude tribes of northern Europe. It was a curious tale, half legend, half history, fancy and fact interwoven in a web of fascination. But what had Crete, the little island empire south of Greece, in common with the tale of Murdock, the orchid hunter, and of Targwa the tribal chieftain over 1,000 leagues away, separated by the length of the Mediterranean Sea and the breadth of the Atlantic Ocean? The puzzle was too great for him to solve. He left it for the time, set back the glowing embers of the fire, placed the vase of Minos in a wall safe, and switched off the lights. On his way to his bedroom, he passed the room set aside for Murdock and smiled at the open door. He knew the sign of the traveler, fresh from months in the open air, to whom closed doors and windows seemed to create a stifling prison. As he tiptoed past, he paused to listen to the orchid hunter's breathing. That the man would never travel again the flowing road he was assured, and he wondered if his guest was resting easily. There was no sound. As Morse stood in the doorway, listening, the street lights faintly illumined the room and the prone figure on the bed, fully dressed. It held a rigidity of pose that alarmed him. He entered and bent above his guest, shook him lightly by the shoulder, then raised his arm. The pulse was irresponsive, and the hand fell heavily upon the quilt. Morse turned on the lights. There was no need for a second glance. Murdock had found his last orchid, had departed on his final trek. Morse telephoned for a physician and sympathetically arranged the wasted form, hardly more than an articulated skeleton. The orchid hunter had been writing. There was a folded paper beneath a book on the desk that was a part of the room's well-chosen furnishings. This was addressed to his host. It read, "My heart is very weak tonight. No pain, only an absence of power that leaves me barely strength to write these words. I leave the vase and its history, not just in gratitude, but because I believe it was given me that the mystery of the city in the sky may be solved. So things work out in the history of us all, I think. The riddle of the race leaves a clue that sooner or later falls into the proper hands. Such hands are yours. Here is my diary, kept daily, and there is a map in my trunk that will guide to Targwa and the canyon of the vision. I have neither kith nor kin. I leave no one to be sorrowful about me save the orchid dealers who made their desk chair profits from my risks. It was a great game while it lasted, and the flowing road is the trail of trails. Good night, good friend, goodbye, perhaps, and, if so, remember, when you enter the city of Dor, your grateful visitor. Ronald Murdock. The physician confirmed Morse's idea that Murdock's death was not to have been put off. Strychnine could hardly have prolonged it, he said after an examination. It does not need an autopsy to tell that the man's heart was rotten. Valve muscles flabby. He was a strong man once. Urari, you say? Humph. That's a local name for Caxoeira, extract of resinous South American barks. Has several alkaloids in its active principle. We really know very little about it save that it is one of the deadliest of poisons. Defies analysis to a certain extent. It must have been a diluted or weakened extract and the slightest of incisions. A friend of yours, Mr. Morse? I am sorry. It was a peaceful death. I will attend to the certificate. And I to his funeral, Morse promised himself. A sudden idea struck him, and he registered it as a vow to make a fitting burial of the sturdy Scotchman. Chapter 3. Laidlaw's Theory. To Stanley Morse, the dead man's letter, as he read it, seemed to bind him to a quest made sacred by the last testament of the orchid hunter. The more he pondered over the idea, the more it found favor with him. He had no ties nor business to keep him in New York, and the fever of adventure was easily stimulated in his veins. The interior of Brazil offered a trip that he had always promised himself, and the prospects of discovering a hidden city soon dominated both his waking thoughts and his dreams at night. A week after Murdock's death, he made a visit to the Metropolitan Museum, where he was made welcome by an assistant curator of archaeology. The museum was already the richer for Morse's travels, and he was privileged to ready admission to the administrative offices and the time and knowledge of its experts. Morse set the vase on the green blotter of the scientist's desk, and, going to the window, raised the blind so that the March sunshine lit the rich metal with a radiance that was dazzling on the high places of the embossed design. "What do you make of that?" he asked. The curator took the vase up reverently, examined it with close scrutiny for 10 silent minutes, then set it down again. "Where did you get it?" he parried. "That is the pith of the story," laughed Morse. "Don't look at me as if you thought I'd been raiding some of your precious cases. I came by it honestly. As a preamble, I'll tell you that I'm not going to give it to the Metropolitan or any other museum. It is dedicated to a special purpose." The official's face fell involuntarily. "Or sell it, I suppose." Morse shook his head. "It's worth a small fortune," said the curator. "It's a perfect example, a glorious example, of a Cretan vase. The tableau is undoubtedly connected with the Minotaur legend. None of the excavations at Knossos have unearthed anything finer. Crete, you know, was given autonomy in 1889 by the European powers, and the government exercises a jealous eye over all discoveries. Do you know anything of the ancient history of the island? I've been reading it up of late. I retained enough of my school days to make out the word Minos. What's the inscription?" The curator shrugged his shoulders. "You'll have to take that to Laidlaw," he said. "I can't decipher it." "Who is Laidlaw?" "Gordon Laidlaw, F.R.G.S., archaeologist and anthropologist. Haven't you met him? He's a master scientist, but from my standpoint pretty much of a crank. He holds an unprovable theory that the lost country of Atlantis, or its remains, is to be found somewhere on the American continent, where it was left after a mighty cataclysm split the Earth into the continents of Africa and America and formed the Atlantic Ocean." The curator spoke almost contemptuously. "Atlantis? Wasn't there some theory a few years back which tied Atlantis and Crete together?" "There was a long article in the London Times about 6 years ago. A man named Martin also advanced the idea. Why? Because this vase was found by an orchid hunter in the center of the Amazonian Chapadao, or plateau. Impossible. I beg your pardon, Mr. Morse, but are you sure of that?" "Absolutely. The curator sprang from his chair and paced his office in his excitement, talking staccato sentences. It's insane, insane. Can there be something in Laidlaw's theory after all? No, it's preposterous. Atlantis is a myth. A theoretic foundling. And you've never met Laidlaw? It's insane, insane. He picked up the vase and fondled it between his palms. May I keep this overnight in the museum? He asked. I want to show it to my colleagues and tell them the story. You haven't heard it yet, said Morse dryly, but I'll tell it to you if you introduce me to Laidlaw. Surely. He lives up in the Berkshires. I'll wire him. He'll be down in the morning tonight, if he could get here. Will you let me know when he arrives? You have my telephone. Of course. Now tell me about the orchid hunter. Morse's decorous valet awakened him the next morning before daylight. There's a person who demands to see you, sir, he said. Quite an extraordinary party, with a face, you'll pardon me, like a wild lion. Name of Laidlaw. Laidlaw. Morse shook off the filmy net of sleep and sat up in bed. Show him up, he ordered. A minute later he heard a bass voice bellowing in the hall. Which room? That one? All right. His door opened as if a gale had forced the lock, and a man, half giant, half dwarf, waddled into the room. Large amber eyes were set in a weather-burned face, as much of it as was discernible in the frame of tawny, shaggy hair and beard that seemed to make up a continuous manner. His nose was beaked like an eagle's, his eyes aflame with a light that might have been equally that of fierceness or a proud invincibility of purpose. Below the broad shoulders, the massive torso was that of a giant. By all fairness the man should have been even feet in height, but ludicrous legs, short, curved like those of a Pekingese spaniel, supported the upper frame. He advanced to the bed, his glance compelling that of the half-awake Morse. Where? Demanded Laidlaw, and his great voice boomed like the roar of a bull. Where is the vase? Morse shook off his sleep and slipped on a dressing robe as he rose to greet his visitor. The vase is not here, Mr. Laidlaw, he said. Not here? You've not lost sight of it? Man, how could you? The visitor groaned and sat down on a chair where the effect of his dwarfed legs was immediately discounted, and he appeared a giant, a troubled giant, mopping his brow and gazing anxiously at Morse. It means comparatively little to you, compared to what it does to me, he went on. I have been scoffed at by my fellows for years on account of a theory that is absolutely sound, but which they smile at to my face and laugh at behind my back, or else say, poor Laidlaw, he's been overdoing things, and he's a bit cracked. I know them. And now comes the chance to choke them with their own laughter, to make them take back the sneers, to make the most important archaeological discovery of all time, and you've let someone get the vase away from you, the vase that would tell me in a moment whether I was a genius or a crackbrain. The man's gestures, the tones of his bass voice, ranging from enthusiasm to deep despair, were almost enough to make Morse laugh. But he hastened to reassure him. It's at the museum. I left it there overnight with our mutual friend. I'm sure it will be perfectly safe with him. The archaeologist groaned. We can't get at it until 10 o'clock, and it's not yet 5. Man. And I've come ramping down from the Berkshires in a rattletrap that stuck in the mud and balked at the hills. Mud up to my waist. I'd have walked to make better time if it hadn't been so deep. I had no idea you'd arrive so soon, Laidlaw. If you had been waiting for the biggest thing in your life for 20-odd years, would you hesitate? Though I beg your pardon for letting my impatience upset your household, to say nothing of your sleep. That's nothing. You've had no breakfast. I'll order some. In the meantime, here is Murdock's diary and his map. I'll be dressed before you've read them. Laidlaw was immediately immersed in the diary. The unconventionality of using his host's bedroom as a reading room did not even occur to him, and Morse smiled to himself at his guest's enthusiasm. He gave instructions for a meal and entered his bathroom. Midway through his shower, the bathroom door opened and Laidlaw's leonine face and massive shoulders protruded through the opening. "If you've ordered eggs," he said, "I forgot to tell you that I cannot eat them if they're more than just thoroughly warmed through. You'll pardon me for mentioning it." Morse smiled again before he turned off the shower. The idea of a man who had devoted a third of his lifetime to one theory with an almost fanatic devotion bothering about the time of his eggs was amusing. "I'm fussy about that myself," he answered. "Always boil them and time them at the table." "Good." Laidlaw's eyes roved over Morse's muscular and athletic figure. "Man, but you're powerfully built," he said. "I wish, but that's one of my faults. I cannot help but envy a well-made man. I've got the torso of Hercules and the legs of a bullfrog." He closed the door abruptly and disappeared. Morse began to entertain a singular liking for his visitor with his almost childlike enthusiasm and frankness. Breakfast was over before 7 o'clock, and after the meal Laidlaw dilated at length upon his theory of the lost city of Atlantis. The main thread of his belief centered in the migration of the Cretans after the Dorian invasion in the 16th century BC to a place on the then western coast of Africa. "All probabilities point to this," he said. "The Cretan, or Minoans, were on most friendly terms with the Egyptians. They were primarily responsible for much of the civilization of ancient Egypt. Their hieroglyphics antedate all others. In Babylonian scripts and many records of Egypt I have found constant reference to Atlantis as a country somewhere toward the west, the setting sun. The Luxor Museum contains a vase and certain inscribed tablets telling of gifts made to Egyptian royalty by the people of Atlantis, and the script and workmanship of the vase are undoubtedly Minoan. Have you a world projection?" They were in the library, and Morse produced a large atlas, which he laid upon the center table and opened at an equivalent projection in which the world was cartographed in an ellipse. Both bent above it. "I am only going to take up the question in hand," said Laidlaw, his face lit up with the belief in his theory. "You are, of course, acquainted with the general idea of world subsidence. The Pacific is studded with the mountaintops of a submerged continent, though its depths are far greater than those of the Atlantic. Not a nation or tribe of either inland or coast possessions, civilized or barbaric, but unites in the story of a great flood. This, I maintain, was caused by, avoiding technical terms, a shrinkage of the Earth's surface due to the settling of substrata even today manifested in lesser degree by earthquakes more or less persistent along recognized zones. Now, look at the contours of North and South America, as opposed to South Africa and Europe. Allowing for lowlands that are now permanently submerged shoals, does not the map resemble a puzzle picture with the assembled portions shaken apart? See how the eastern angle of Brazil, at Cape St. Roque, would fit snugly into the Gulf of Guinea. The bulk of the Sahara Desert lie along the retreating northeastern coast of South America. The lower half of the same continental coastline correspond with that of southwestern Africa. Morse followed the argument with an interest that began to be leavened by the other. Man's conviction. The theory was at least plausible. So, then presume that this cataclysm found the Minoan, then settled in their new country of Atlantis, established somewhere westward of what is now Cape Verde, in the Franco-African possessions. After the movement had subsided, the survivors found themselves on the Brazilian coast, in the neighborhood of Para, south of the Amazon, itself a subsidiary crack of the catastrophe reaching more than 2/3 of the way across South America. The sands of Sahara, the sandstone plateaus of Brazil are coeval. The idea was startling, revolutionary, yet to Morse, listening to the inspired voice of Laidlaw, it gained possibility. But would the Minoans or Atlanteans survive such a catastrophe? Why not? Other tribes did, and handed down the story of the deluge. There is no reason why their descendants should not be living today. Remember, There have been persistent rumors since the earliest explorations of white-skinned peoples living in the remote interior of South America. If we find a people in Dor who show the characteristics of Atlantis or Crete, why then my critics are confounded, and you and I will have achieved no small measure of fame. What time is it? He broke off. 8 o'clock. I can't wait 2 hours, Morse. It's an impossibility. Where is your telephone? He called the assistant curator at his home and persuaded him to meet them at the museum within half an hour. Falling in with his mood, Morse brought his car around and within a quarter of an hour they were standing on the steps of the Metropolitan, with 15 idle minutes facing them. Morse lit a pipe and watched Laidlaw curiously. The latter paced up and down with the nearest attempt to astride his ridiculous legs would permit. It would be a rash man, Morse thought, who would make open fun of the scientist's physique. The mighty chest, and arms that swung below the knee, the leonine face, eagle nose, and keen eyes held a promise of more than ordinary strength that would easily offset the handicap of the bowed, short legs. Laidlaw might lower the pace on a trail, but he would be a good man to have along in a pinch. The assistant curator appeared at last, stepping down from a bus and blinking through his glasses. Laidlaw waddled down the steps, clutched him by the arm to the amusement of the passers-by, and almost bore the slighter man up to the museum entrance, not releasing his clutch until after they were in the department office. Then he spoke for the first time. "The vase," he gasped. "If you'll let go my arm," said the curator, with mild reproach, "I'll get it out of the vault." Laidlaw mumbled an apology, and the museum official departed, rubbing his almost paralyzed arm. When he returned, he handed the vase over to Morse, who in turn handed it to the expectant Laidlaw. The theorist trotted to the window with his prize like some great mastiff with a bone, and examined it minutely, inside and out, from all angles. There came a series of grunts from him that Morse translated as both favorable and excited. "What did the museum authorities think of it?" he asked the curator. "Cretin, beyond a doubt. You will pardon me, Mr. Morse, but our experts are inclined to believe some extraordinary coincidence must have taken that vase to the Brazilian jungle. Some old-world adventurer, who carried it with him on all his journeys. The other suggestion appears to be inexplicable." Morse shrugged his shoulders. "It is interesting," he said. "I am going to see what there is in it. I have always intended an expedition into the heart of Brazil." "Is Laidlaw going with you?" For the moment Morse was frankly at fault. Then he laughed. "To tell you the truth, I had never thought of him as not doing so. Since he arrived at my house before daylight there has been little doubt of his determination, and he apparently took it for granted that I agreed with him. Even if I had not practically planned the trip, Laidlaw has a certain way with him." The curator nodded. "Most fanatics have a gift for persuasion, but I shouldn't call him that. He may be right. Who knows?" And then, changing the subject, "Mr. Morse, the faculty has empowered me to make you a very liberal offer for the vase. It should be preserved for science and the public benefit." "If it passed from me to the museum it would be as a gift," said Morse. "But that is impossible." "As a loan? While you are absent?" "I'll tell you what I'll do," said Morse jestingly. "If you think you can get it away from Laidlaw, I might agree. But seriously, it may be useful on the trip. I want to take it along, and I have decided to dedicate it to an object that is more or less sacred to me. If we get through and back again, I'll bring the museum something that will more than make up for it." In the meantime, Laidlaw, his face aglow, had left the window and seated himself at the desk, entirely unconscious of the presence of anyone. Vase in front of him, he was copying the characters of the script onto a pad, evidently intending to waste no time in deciphering them. "He'll do in a few minutes what would take us hours," whispered the curator to Morse. He is the acknowledged authority on Minoan law for all his tangential ideas. They watched him working energetically, arranging the symbols, grouping and comparing them. Presently, he laid down his pencil with a sigh and gazed into vacancy, exultation irradiating his strong features. Morse and the curator moved toward him. He regarded them blankly, then recognition slowly came into his eyes. "There," he said triumphantly, "is a literal translation of the linear script. No doubt Mr. Morse will permit photographs of the vase before we take it with us. There is no time for confutation before we start. It is up to the museum to verify this translation and to prepare the world for what will come out of Brazil. Listen. Minos, son of Zeus, and Europa, Minos the sun god. Husband of Pasiphae, the all-shining Pasiphae, the moon goddess. Father of Ariadne, the exceeding holy Ariadne, the nature mother. Minos the king of kings, Minos the lawgiver. Made by Zal the artificer in the 49th generation after the great flood in the 7th year of the reign of the 5th Pta, descendant of Minos, king of the new Atlantis in his capital of Dor." Laidlaw brought his great fist down on the oak desk with a schwack that splashed the ink from the wells. "Ha!" he exclaimed. "Refute that if you can. The 49th generation after the great flood in the reign of the 5th Pta, king of the new Atlantis. The gift vase in the Luxor Museum bore the name of Pta the First." He turned to Morse. "And I am taking the glory," he said. "It is you who have solved the matter. Wherever the name of Laidlaw is mentioned, that of Morse must be coupled with it." Suddenly his exultation faded, and his face grew anxious. "Mr. Morse," he said, "I have been carried away by my own enthusiasm. I have thought you shared it. You have been so interested, so cordial to me, a crude and blustering fool who broke in on you like a thief in the night. I have assumed you were going to Dor. It is your discovery, I have no right to exploit it without your permission. I understand you are an explorer, that you know much of South America. Say no more, Laidlaw. I am going to Dor, I have a mission there aside from the adventure. You will join me, of course. You are a scientist, I am merely an explorer, and an amateur one at that. It would lend me dignity if you were to go along." The face of Laidlaw cleared and he gripped Morse's hand silently, his features working in their emotion. "There is one condition," said Morse, as he released his fingers and slipped his hands into his pocket. "Anything." "What is it?" "That you reserve your handshakes for your enemies, not your friends. I won't be able to hold a pen for a week." Chapter 4. Caxoeira Canyon. Vivid flashes of forked lightning, following hot puffs of wind, illuminated the aisles of the Amazonian forest, inky black between the intervals. The long line of carriers, tired of struggling over and under the tough festoons of tree roots and ground vines and the trailing lianas that disputed every inch of the trail, came to a sudden halt. The two leaders, stumbling persistently behind the bearers, confirmed the move, and the Morse-Laidlaw expedition tried to find secure shelter from the coming storm that had driven night before it in such untimely fashion. There was little cover from the threatened hurricane that could be considered satisfactory. The cargadors threw their burdens beneath the heaviest undergrowth they could find, and, with their employers, leaned against the tree trunks. Morse and Laidlaw ensconced themselves in a fold of a great masaranduba, cow tree, as the first heavy drops fell. "I'm not built for this trail, Morse," said Laidlaw, though his cheery voice evinced no complaint. "I've tripped up in these infernal jungle traps a dozen times. My nose is bleeding, and I've cracked both shins falling on my rifle. And I've been swung off my feet with a noose about my neck about as often," replied Morse. "We're due here till morning, anyway. By tomorrow night I hope to reach Apra. Here it comes." They shrank against the mighty bowl as the gale swept through the forest, the roar of the wind intensified by the crackling of trees that were literally uprooted and tossed by the tempest as if they had been so many wisps of straw. Two sturdy trunks crashed down close to their feet, and only the giant spread of mighty bough above them saved them from destruction. In the intermittent pauses of the storm, the shrieks of monkeys and the screeching of parrots and herons joined the wailing of the bearers and machete men in an appalling din. Birds flapped heavily to the branches overhead, animals shuffled in among them, and once a wild cry of dismay went up as a great snake wound its scaly length among the Indians, too disturbed for attack. The gale lasted 2 hours. It was the last effort of the rainy season, and had not been unexpected by Morse, who had deliberately chosen the time of the trip to take advantage of the high water in the rivers. They had come by steamship to Para, at the mouth of the Amazon, traversed 870 miles of the flowing road to the mouth of the Madeira, and ascended that tributary nearly 700 miles in a launch to the San Antonio Falls, above which the river raged in continuous rapids for 300 miles, impossible for upriver travel. At San Antonio, they engaged their porters and machete men and struck eastward across the great plateau broken up into subsidiary chapadales, crossing the Tapajos River at Taguarezino, and its tributary, the Manuel, at the border angle of Para and Mato Grosso states, reaching the old, half-grown trail of Murdock, and arriving with a few days' march of Apra village, at a stream marked on the orchid hunter's map as Caxoeira, in the beginning of May, with 6 months of good weather in prospect. It had been a hard trek, and the caravan showed signs of the trying out process. Morse had marveled at Laidlaw's adaptation to the trying conditions. Once eggs disappeared inexorably from the menu, he made neither murmur nor suggestion as to meals, accepting chameleon or monkey with manioc for vegetable and banana for dessert with equanimity. The drawback of his short legs was eliminated by his endurance. Once, for sport, he had drawn himself up into the lianas and swung along above ground for 100 yards as easily as a gorilla, scaring the prehensile-tailed monkeys that chattered above him and striking awe into the hearts of the Indians. The quest well started, nothing seemed to disturb a certain humorous equanimity that characterized him and made him an ideal trail companion. Torrential rains soaked them, they steamed in their own perspiration, gnats and gordiflied, heavy-shelled beetles, all laden with poison sacs and natural hypodermic syringes, tormented them, but they proved immune to the fevers, and their formidable numbers and equipment secured them from hostile attacks. Morse was in top condition. By dint of strict discipline and a general knowledge of conditions, he kept his train in similar shape, and they made unprecedented time. Across the grassy summits of the Chapadales, the day's march was more often over than under 20 miles, and a general spirit of confidence in their own ability permeated the party. Morse had said nothing to the bearers concerning the real object of the expedition. He had consulted with Laidlaw, and they had decided to keep silent. "We may not be welcome at Dor," Morse suggested, and, according to Murdock, the Indians seem inclined to be superstitious in the matter. "We don't want to lose them before we reach Apra." In spare hours since they had left New York, Morse applied himself, under the tutelage of Laidlaw, to acquiring facility in ancient Greek and learning to decipher the symbols of Cretan pictorial and linear script. "There will be variations in the language, undoubtedly," said Laidlaw, "but the roots may be the same, and present practice will prove a fine working basis." So Morse resurrected the memories of his school and college classics and pounded away until he was able to converse freely with Laidlaw. Except where the Greek held no equivalence for the names of modern articles, they practically adopted it in place of English. Dialects spring up and mother languages alter with change of location and climate, much as we will undoubtedly find the old Cretan ceremonials and customs, religious and social, dominated by local conditions, warned Laidlaw. If the snow-capped cone mentioned by Murdock is a volcano, it will undoubtedly have had its influence on their worship. The old Minotaur legend will likely have become a myth unless they have cattle, which I doubt. The volcanic fires will have an important part in their ritual, I imagine. Though it is, of course, all theory on my part. With education and speculation, the time passed quickly, and it seemed only a short time since Laidlaw had first burst into Morse's bedroom. A genuine friendship, founded on mutual peril and respect for each other's bearing and sturdy manhood, sprang up between the two men. Morse was amazed at the resources of Laidlaw's learning, and Laidlaw treated the other as a son of whom he was justly proud, relegating to him the leadership by right of experience and capability. The morning after the storm, Morse broke camp at daybreak. The hurricane had blazed a broad trail of uprooted trees, torn undergrowth, and lianas through the forest and strewn it with boughs and branches. Dead birds lay here and there, and one great limb had smashed to a pulp a great anaconda fully 30 feet in length and as thick around as Morse's thigh. According to the map, they had crossed the last watercourse and had now only to climb out of the valley to the highlands where Tagua ruled the village of Apra. During the morning they made good progress, and at sunset they arrived at the village and sent in word to its ruler with gifts of bright-colored prints. There was no surprise at their appearance. The jungle wireless had announced them as it had elsewhere along the route. The bearers fraternized with the half-naked Pisonos of the village, and two headmen escorted Morse and Laidlaw to a large bamboo hut which they speedily made comfortable with their camp equipment. Morse asked for Tagua by name. "Tell him," he said, "that we are friends of Murdock, to whom he made the present of the cup of gold." The response from the chief took initial form in return presents of fat capybaras, an agouti, and an armadillo, together with wild figs and bananas. In half an hour the chief arrived, apologizing for his delay. He had been in a mud bath for his rheumatism, and had waited to cleanse himself. He limped badly, and was evidently in pain, though he beamed with evident friendliness. "You come from Senhor Miradosh?" he asked in the flowing Indian dialect. "Does he send greetings?" "Greetings from beyond the trail, Tagua. The Senhor is dead." "Yeah. It is bad news. He was a good man. I linger like an old tree, but he is taken." He lapsed into silence which the Americans did not interrupt. At length he asked, "What may I do for you?" Morse repeated the story told by the orchid hunter. "We would find the city and enter it," he concluded. Tagua sank back in mingled incredulity and horror. "It is impossible," he exclaimed. "The way is closed, and they permit no strangers within the city save as bondmen. You cannot go alone. And none of the Pisonos would dare go with you. It is a land of ghosts who dwell sometimes on the land and sometimes in the sky. Have I not seen it? Did not Miradosh see the sky city and the people walking?" "Nevertheless we will go," declared Morse, "even if we go alone. Where is the way?" "You are strong men and brave," said the chief thoughtfully, "and friends of my friend. Therefore I warn you. But you men of other jungles are all mad and most stubborn. Yet, maybe you are magicians. Have I not heard of him who swings in the trees and talks to the apes like a brother?" It was somewhat of an exaggeration, but Laidlaw, who had long ago mastered the key language of the Amazonian dialects, laughed. "But that will not help you scale the walls," Tagua went on. "The way leads by the stairs that Miradosh told you of, but they are broken and the ghosts have sealed the cliff. Give it up, senors. Maybe tomorrow you may see the sky city from the campo. I myself will lead you opposite the stairway. Then return while still your bodies hold your soul." They quizzed him, but he could add nothing to the dim legend that once the Indians had been forced to work in the land of the ghost people and had been driven out at the end of their task, his ancestor bringing with him the golden vase he had taken. Morse opened a pack and produced it, setting it on the camp table. A cover for the vase had been made at his direction, carefully designed to conform with the original. This was soldered tightly to the bowl. "This cup," he said, "was given me by our friend. In it are his ashes. I shall give them burial within the city of Dor. I swear it," he added, setting one hand upon the urn. Tagua looked at him with astonished admiration. If you say so, then I believe you will do it. Outside the hut, the night was filled with weird noises when they emerged. Tagua had declared a feast in his visitor's honor. Fires blazed at the ends of the mud-caked street, and villagers dressed in gaudy prints, bedecked with strings of alligator teeth, feathers, and lustrous bird skins paraded up and down behind musicians beating loudly on drums and blowing piercing notes through reed flutes in rude rhythm. With them mingled the bearers and machete men. Native liquors were in evidence, and the crowd sang and danced at will. At the appearance of Tagua and his guests, the crowd entered a big hut decorated with fresh palm trees and lit by tallow dips along the walls. The chief conducted Morse and Laidlaw to a platform at one end to watch the dancing, which took place on the uneven mud floor with much stamping of feet to the drums and flutes. It was evident that before long the native ferments would be in full possession. Morse took advantage of the first pause brought about by temporary exhaustion and stated the object of the expedition. With the first mention of the Sky City, a silence fell upon the mob. He concluded with a call for volunteers, promising a rifle to each man and other rewards that would make them comparatively rich for life. The men shuffled their feet and whispered among themselves, and Tagua spoke. I am old and useless, he said. Also I am afraid of the ghost people. Yet would I go with these two if only that shame should not be set upon my village and Apra be called the abode of cowards. Maya, he singled out a tall warrior hung with rows of alligator teeth, what say you? The men stepped forward. His chest bore the scars of close encounter with some sharp-clawed jungle denizen, he carried his head high, and was evidently regarded as a sub-chief. If I send an arrow against a jaguar or a man, he said, I know when I have hit. If I miss, it is my fault. But how can one fight against ghosts when the arrow pierces a shadow and is lost in a cloud? Yet am I no coward. What one dares I dare? Kolo. Will you follow these strangers with me? Kolo, long and lean, streaks of grey in his black hair, not an ounce of spare flesh on his body, naked save for a breech clout, corded with stringy muscles, came to the side of Maya. I will go, he said simply. But that was the end of the recruiting. The men who had accompanied the expedition were paid, and neither Morse's offer of high payment nor Tagua's persuasive powers could coax another warrior into service. Maya and Kolo were the best hunters of the district, Tagua said, and both had performed notable deeds in war against hostile tribes. Better still, while both were adepts with spear and bow and blowgun, Tagua had entrusted them from time to time with the use of the rifle given him by Murdock, and they were accustomed to its use and fairly good shots. It was not Morse's idea to make an entry into the mystic city with any force that might be construed as an attempt at invasion, but he had hoped to secure enough men to bear the bulk of his equipment. With only Maya and Kolo available, he and Laidlaw were forced to spend the morning reducing their outfit to only the most necessary articles. The two Indians were entrusted with rifles, Morse and Laidlaw, besides these, armed themselves with automatic pistols. A few presents, a compass, powerful flashlights, some few canned provisions, with ammunition, made up the bulk of what they selected to take with them. The rest Morse gave into Tagua's charge. If we do not return for these before the rainy season, they are yours, he said, after opening one bale that contained cotton goods of startling color and design, which he gave outright to the chief. They set out in mid-afternoon for the spot where Murdock had camped across the canyon from the stone steps. Tagua accompanied them. Close to sunset they came out of a clump of carrasco upon the edge of the precipice. The wall dropped almost sheer 500 feet to the torrent, which, swollen by the recent rain, swirled and seethed from bank to bank. The opposing cliff was far higher than the one they stood upon, a perpendicular scarp of rock on the rim lifting up to almost 1,000 feet. The setting sun was almost level with the flat summit of the plateau behind them and painted the farther cliff with a broad band of rose. Beneath their feet the canyon was in shadow, in which the foaming rapids showed like a cavalry charge of grey horses. Morse imagined that he could dimly make out the stone steps leading halfway up the cliff. Laidlaw was gazing at the summit of the opposing wall, sharp against the eastern sky of pale turquoise matrix green, flecked here and there with little rosy clouds, the heralds of the gorgeous afterglow to follow. Suddenly he drew in his breath sharply, and Morse looked up. Tagua, Maya, and Kolo were on their hands and knees, their heads resting on the ground. In the sky, ethereal, slightly tremulous, but distinct, was the vision of a city built upon the shores of a lake that held the reflections of its stone buildings and of colonnaded temples that seemed to be hewn out of the solid rock. On the lake, ships were being rowed shoreward with banks of oars, some propelled by sails of striped material. A multitude of people were passing along a paved highway by the edge of the water. Luxuriant verdure set off the buildings, and, reared from the back cliff, there rose a snow-capped dome with a plume of smoke lazily curling from its peak. As the sun dropped behind the western edge of the plateau, the colors of the mirage blended with the afterglow. The waters of the lake seemed to slowly rise and inundate the city. The plume of smoke became a floating cloud, and the vision vanished. Morse and Laidlaw turned in common impulse and clasped hands. There was no need for words. It was the city of Dor, cloud-painted indeed, but a sky canvas copied from an original that lay somewhere beyond the high precipice that now bent a grim frown upon them. The rosy band vanished with the descending sun. Chapter 5. Kiron. Morse and the scientist were on the canyon rim before sunup, but no mirage greeted them. Evidently the vision occurred only during certain atmospheric conditions. To both of them its timely appearance upon their arrival seemed a happy harbinger. But, as they gazed into the depths of the gorge, evidence that the real difficulty of the quest was just making itself manifest was very clear. In the still morning air the hissing rush of the turbulent waters far below them was plainly heard. The descent from where they stood appeared impossible, nor, as far as they could see in either direction, could they determine any natural trace of a trail. In the present high condition of the water, the torrent lapped over the precipice without indication of a beach from which to launch whatever craft they might use in crossing. Opposite the stairway, which led only to a narrow ledge, the Caxoeira surged in a great whirlpool, part of the giant eddy evidently occupying a hollow in the cliff directly below them. As they gazed, great logs came riding down the current, tossed about like matches in a millstream, rearing half their length out of the wild race of tawny waters as they struck against submerged rocks, plunging, splintered and sullen, back into the tide to be carried on the circle of the whirlpool till they were sucked into the vortex or spurned from the outer eddies into the main current. "We'll have to wait a day or so until the water goes down," said Morse. "We could get down the cliff with ropes, but to cross that flood is a different proposition, even if we had a raft ready built and at water level." Laidlaw shrugged his shoulders resignedly. "I suppose so," he answered, scanning closely the stairway with his binoculars. "There is no doubt but that has been built up with a masonry of boulders and cement," he said. "But either it led to a higher ledge which has fallen away, or Tagua's story of the opening appears to be sheer legend. I can't find a sign of any entrance, past or present. But it must have been built for some purpose and led to or from somewhere." Tagua had returned to his village the night before, and neither Maya nor Kolo could offer any enlightenment. Maya volunteered the information that the stream was 15 feet above its usual height and might be expected to return to normal within 48 hours. "But the whirlpool," he added, "is always present. A mile upstream, the cliff could be descended to a stony beach as soon as the water subsided. We should find plenty of stranded logs to make a catamaran," said Morse. "We can use lianas to bind it together. They are even better than rope. And we'll need poles and paddles." He gave the order to Maya and Kolo to descend to timber level and secure these, with sufficient green lianas, when Laidlaw, who had continued his examination of the stairs, grasped his arm and drew him back from the brink of the cliff, motioning at the same time to the Indians to follow the movement. "What is it?" asked Morse. Laidlaw's face was flushed, his eyes blazing with excitement. "Crawl out to the edge, and you'll see," he answered, setting the example. Flat on their stomachs they cautiously moved to the brink, Maya and Kolo wriggling behind them like snakes. The face of the cliff that backed the ledge to which the stone steps led was no longer a blank wall. In it appeared two openings, symmetrical, equal, evidently the work of man, separated by a narrow strip of rock that protruded like a tongue across the ledge. "A slab that swings on a pivot," muttered Laidlaw in Morse's ear. "Worked from within only, in all probability. But an entrance nevertheless. Look." The word was superfluous. The attention of the full pair of eyes was glued to the openings not far below their own level. Through the right-hand portal came a figure, clad in a loin-cloth of red and yellow stripes, fringed to the knees. A short cape of jaguar skin hung over one shoulder. In one hand he bore a long wand tipped with metal. His skin was copper-colored, but worn and weathered like some piece of driftwood from the sea. Through their glasses, Morse and Laidlaw saw, with growing eagerness, that the man was an Indian, but unlike any they had ever seen. Laidlaw's hand rested on Morse's shoulder, and his powerful fingers sank deep into the latter's muscles. 4 more Indians issued from the heart of the cliff. These wore only short clouts of yellow. Between them they bore the naked figure of a man, bound with arms tight lashed to his sides, the ropes encircling him to his ankles so that the body was stiffened with the wrappings. His skin was in marked contrast to the others. Where the sun had not tanned it, it was white. Through their glasses they could see the man's lips move, though the noise of the river drowned his words. His face was calmly contemptuous, the features regular, the hair smooth and dark. His captors made no attempt at answer, but laid him down on the ledge, helpless. The man with the staff bent over him and ordered some loose boulders to be set between him and the rim of the ledge. Then he motioned to the others, who preceded him into the dark mouth of the tunnel. 10 seconds after their disappearance the slab turned on its pivot and fitted into the cliff so completely that the powerful glasses failed to reveal a trace of its existence. Morse sprang to his feet, followed by Laidlaw. "He's not an Indian," he cried. "He is a Greek, distinctly a Greek," said Laidlaw. "Whatever he is, we've got to get him off of that," said Morse, and suddenly cupped his hands and shouted. The man, by frightful effort, had succeeded in slightly arching himself upon the soles of his feet and the top of his head and was trying to edge himself to the verge of the narrow platform. "He can't get by those boulders," said Laidlaw. "That's what they put them there for." "I'm not so sure of that," replied Morse. "He's making a desperate attempt. He didn't hear me. I wish we had a megaphone." "You try it, Laidlaw. Tackle him in Greek." The next instant the scientist's stentorian voice bellowed its message. It bridged the noise of the stream and the bound man turned his face toward them as Laidlaw repeated his brief sentence of friendship and promised help. A slight smile passed over the man's face, but he renewed his efforts, only to abandon them temporarily from exhaustion. "He understands me, I am sure of that," said Laidlaw. "But he seems bent on killing himself. I wonder what he's afraid of." The question was answered by a shadow that slid over the ground among their own. Looking up, they saw a great bird soaring in the blue. Higher up was another speck, and beyond that yet another. "Urubu," said Maya briefly, as the vulture planed downward in a great spiral. "That's what he's afraid of," said Morse. "Before we could reach him those brutes will strip his bones. I imagine he's afraid of losing consciousness, and they may not wait until he's dead, seeing him helpless. He prefers a quick death to a slow one. Well, we can discourage their little game." The scavenger of the sky wheeled so close above their heads that they could feel the draft from its outspread pinions, the naked, repulsive neck craning from a ruff of dirty white feathers, its eyes regarding them curiously but unafraid. Laidlaw raised his rifle. Better wait till he lights and make sure of him, said Morse. And look out for ricochets. I'll leave it to you, said Laidlaw. You're the better shot. But don't leave that poor devil down there in suspense, tortured like a modern Prometheus. The vulture suddenly lifted his wings tip to tip and dropped plummetwise to the ledge, where he spread his pinions for balance, losing all the grace of his early motion as he shuffled along the ledge toward the helpless man. Morse's rifle cracked. The bullet thudded softly into the broad back of the bird between its shoulders, and with a harsh croak it toppled from the ledge and fell into the whirlpool, a lifeless bundle of feathers. Next, said Morse grimly, levering a cartridge into position. Another vulture hovered uncertainly above the canyon, and, gaining courage, made the ledge, only to meet the fate of the first bird. A third, realizing that unusual conditions prevailed, halted on the topmost rim of the cliff, peering over until a bullet settled him. You'll kill the bound man from fright yet, said Laidlaw, to judge from his face. He must take us for gods. That's a dangerous role to adopt, from all I've seen, said Morse. I don't see any more of the brutes about. I fancy we've accounted for the local air patrol. Now we've got to get across to him somehow. He must be in torture from those ropes. Tell him we're coming, Laidlaw. The scientist roared his message across the gulf, and the man nodded. Apparently the summary slaughter of the birds inspired him with confidence in the men who spoke to him in his own tongue, for he ceased struggling. Now then, said Morse, we've got a man-sized job ahead. Let's get at it, Maya. The Indians disappeared on the run, and Morse and Laidlaw overhauled their store of strong hempen line, set aside some provisions, and cached their rifles and the remainder of their goods in the thick brush, retaining only their automatics. Maya and Kolo returned with a supply of lianas and half a dozen stout poles which they had trimmed with hand axes. There was no time for shaping paddles, and Kolo explained that they would not be necessary. He studied the whirlpool intently, and Morse passed his field glasses for better observation. With a brief grunt at the power of the lenses, Kolo continued his survey of the eddies for several minutes. I think, he said, there is a big cave below, so. He scooped out an imaginary hollow with his arms and squatted on his haunches. We will make a raft and find the current. He traced the proposed course with his finger in the soil. If we keep close into this side, we will follow the water to the other. Then Maya and I will jump ashore on the steps. There is a big rock there for anchor. Even from the height it seemed a desperate venture, but Morse knew the skill and knowledge of the Indian raftsmen, and their two companions were superb examples of courage and strength. Gathering up the equipment, they followed Maya to the point where he declared descent was practicable. It was a hard climb, encumbered as they were, with sheer descents from ledge to ledge, but they accomplished it at last and stood on a great, level-surfaced boulder a foot above the rapids. Kolo took the hempen lines they had brought and busied himself in the manufacture of a lariat, while Maya carefully surveyed the preliminary eddies. Speech was only possible by shouting above the thunder of the raging water, racing by with tawny manes, fretting at the rocks that curbed its mad career to the Amazon, 1,000 miles away. The Indian poised himself, his fellow standing clear of the whirling loop, holding with Morse and Laidlaw the slack of his line in readiness to take up the sudden tug. A log came riding down the cataract, its heavier but lifting the lighter upper half. Kolo tossed the lariat, and the noose settled fairly behind the projection of a broken branch. The swift pull almost dragged the four men from the boulder before Morse could snub the line about a smaller rock and bring the log to rest alongside their impromptu wharf. In half an hour they had secured 6 fairly matched logs and dragged them on the boulder. Then they set to work to make 4 of them into a rude platform, binding them together with the lianas. Laidlaw's strength was a notable aid in hauling tight the lashings. The 2 remaining logs they arranged as outriders, rigging them with some branches that the current had already washed among the rocks. When it was completed they were smoking with perspiration and ready for rest and food. "We'd better strip, Laidlaw," said Morse, as they finished the meal. "We may stand a better chance if we have an upset." "Small chance of getting free of that maelstrom," said Laidlaw, as he began to peel his sweat-glued shirt from his massive chest. "What do we do?" "We'll fend off when we're told," said Morse. "Otherwise we'll leave it to Maya and Colo." It was hard work to launch the catamaran, which, the moment it was freed, was swept away in the clutch of the current, bucking like the craziest of wild horses. The Americans knelt for steadiness, but Maya and Colo, balancing themselves, rode the writhing logs upright, one at either end of the raft. Their judgment of the swift surges was marvelous, seeming to see the hidden rocks as plainly as if the torrent bed was dry, while thrusting with their poles and avoiding a dozen disasters in a minute, and keeping the catamaran close to the nearer shore. In 5 minutes they had entered the whirlpool, and the hollow predicted by Colo showed in a deep cavern swept by the tawny, foam-streaked waters. The rocking logs, threatening every instant to tear away from the tough web of the lianas, were sucked under the cliff by a force that seemed bent on smashing them against the inner wall. "Yari!" shouted Colo, and Morse and Laidlaw thrust with all their might. The stout poles bent like bows, and Morse felt his muscles cracking with the strain, while Laidlaw's stood out from the mighty shoulders like clustering snakes. A second more and they were free of the hollow and riding the circumference of the whirlpool in a great arc toward the opposite shore and the stone staircase. Colo crouched for his leap and sprang, his bronze body lithe as that of a jaguar, carrying a line with him which he quickly cast about the boulder he had noted from the cliff top. Maya followed with another line, and slipped on the wet surface of the rock, falling waist-deep into the torrent. For an instant the raft swung to the single line, taut as a harp string, opposing the full force of the current. Maya, clinging with one hand to his rock, pitched the line he still held to Colo, who took 2 swift turns about the boulder. The double cable held. Maya scrambled ashore, and Morse and Laidlaw followed in safety just as the first line parted with a twang. The raft swung broadside and the second line, chafing against a sharp surface, gave way. The logs, suddenly released, entered the whirlpool at a tangent and were rapidly drawn into the vortex, disappearing in a broken jumble. "Touch and go, Laidlaw. There goes the grub." "How do we get back?" replied his companion with a grin. "If I wait till that stream goes down I'll be too weak to wade, much less swim." "We won't go thirsty, anyway," answered Morse. "Where's that bundle?" He looked for a special parcel of restoratives bound tightly with the lesser lianas that he had tossed ahead of him. It had dropped safely on the surface of the steps, and he picked it up. The lower treads of the stone stairway, and they were obviously cut by human hands, were submerged. The remainder led steeply up the side of the cliff, broken away here and there, but easily surmountable. The party hurried up them to the ledge where the prisoner lay. As the 4 came into sight of the bound man, they stopped dead in their tracks. Close by the prostrate form poised a great vulture, beak ready to plunge into the unprotected man's face. Morse's pistol flashed from its belt holster, and the foul creature fell, flapping feebly, across the form of its intended victim. Laidlaw, as swiftly as his short legs would allow, reached it and flung it by one wing far out into the canyon. The man had fainted. Maya and Colo slashed at the leather strips that had sunk cruelly and deeply into his flesh, while Laidlaw chafed the released limbs with gentle strength and Morse forced a few drops of aguardiente between the clenched teeth. The man swallowed, coughed on a second mouthful, and opened his eyes upon the solicitous face of Morse upon whose knee his own head rested. "We are friends," said Morse in Greek. For a second the man's eyes looked puzzled, then he smiled and answered in a swift gush of words of which Morse only vaguely caught the drift. Laidlaw answered promptly, and the two began an animated conversation which Morse interrupted by an offer of iguana flesh and bananas which the man gratefully accepted. "You'll soon get the swing of what he says," Laidlaw told Morse in English. The language was certain to have some variance, but essentially it is the Greek of Homer. I will ask him to talk more slowly. He has said that we are not friends, but his preservers, gods, in fact. I am trying to disabuse him of that idea. When their patient had completed his meal, Laidlaw looked whimsically across the scraps at Morse. I wish I were a god, he said. I wouldn't be so dependent on food. You haven't got a banana or two hidden away for supper, have you? The two Indians had taken over the rubbing of the Atlantean's limbs, massaging them methodically, apparently a little in awe of him. He accepted their ministrations as one born for such attention. Presently he stood up and stretched himself, going through a series of calisthenics that he persisted in despite his evident stiffness. His body was as finely modeled as a Greek statue, muscles showing evidence of athletic training, ivory skin speaking eloquently of special care. Beside Laidlaw he appeared almost a stripling. The Atlantean was more a reduced replica of Morse's almost perfect physique. As the twilight gathered in the depths of the Canyon L and the setting sun painted its daily band of rose on the cliff above their heads, he told his story. I am Kiron, he began, with a proud consciousness of all the name imported among his own people. Male regent of the New Atlantis. In the 123rd generation after the Great Flood, Laidlaw looked meaningly at Morse. The last PTA died without issue, and the people were divided concerning a successor. So the kingdom was made a double kingdom, and a son and a daughter of the two brothers of PTA were made joint rulers. Ever since then a king and queen have reigned over the land together. Now, Rana, daughter of my uncle, is queen. She is ambitious to establish an individual monarchy, both from her own desires and those of the priests under Ru, who is their chief. Rana is not my consort, for it is against our law for the children of brothers or sisters to mate with each other. Neither is there love between us, nor has there ever been. Moreover, my heart is long given elsewhere. Therefore, she and Ru plotted against me that Rana might rule, for there is no one of the rank to take my place. Open warfare they feared lest the best of the land be killed. For you must know that we people of Atlantis mingle not with other nations, and much care has been given to our breeding that the race might sustain its strength and beauty. It is the law of Atlantis that none may lead who are not perfect in body. Indeed, despite all care in mating and the development of the young men and maidens, we have lost much in stature. He paused and gazed admiringly at Morse. There goes any lingering idea of my godhood, said Laidlaw. I don't qualify. Kiron resumed his tale. Rana and Ru sent me a message to come to her in secret on a question of grave import. When I did so, they commanded me to be seized and borne to this place by the secret way that has been closed for many generations, leaving me here for the vultures to devour. It was a shrewd stroke. I was at my private palace of Zut, and crossed the lake by night last night, and none saw my entrance to the palace by the royal water gate save my slaves. I found Rana and Ru, and their henchmen made me captive without preamble. No others know what has befallen me, and Rana and Ru would not dare announce it. For I am beloved of my people. They brought me here at daybreak, and as the bird settled for its meal, you came. Henceforth you are as my brothers. He extended his hands to them with a gesture of equality. Will not your slaves tell of your visit? All Atlantean slaves are bred dumb, Kiron answered. Neither can they read nor write. We find that it makes them far less prone to revolt. It is a good custom. He looked casually at the two Indians, squatting apart, and they seemed to catch the import of his words. Now, my brothers, said Kiron, tell me of your purpose and of your own land, in which doubtless you are princes. Laidlaw complied, Morse listening with increasing ease as the familiar accents of the scientist's voice aided him to catch the change of phrasing and of word endings. The scientist dealt lightly with American customs and democracy, and soon included Morse in his story with the discovery of the vase. Kiron's interest evinced itself by his rapt silence. Night fell as Laidlaw told of his own researches in Europe and Northern Africa, of his theory and its apparent proving. The stars came out and the shining constellations changed as they swung above the canyon gap, but Laidlaw still boomed his tale in sonorous Greek. They were 3,000 feet above sea level. The night was warm and two men, one naked and the other practically so, listened to a third, whose mighty upper body showed grey in the dusk, tell his strange story. The two Indians, smudges of silent statuary, hunkered with heads on their knees, appeared to sleep as Laidlaw knitted together the ravelled web of bygone ages and annihilated the years, while below them the torrent labored at the never-ending task of world-shaping. "By all the gods, that is a mighty tale," said Kiron. "And you may hold me witness that it is the truth. As Prince Regent, I was taught much of our law that is hidden from all save the priests and monarchs, and your story bridges the chasms and throws light upon the dark places. You shall hear you and be abashed before your knowledge, and all Atlantis shall proclaim your wisdom." He turned to set a friendly hand upon Morse's arm. "And you, brother, who are formed even as Minos himself, son of Zeus and god of the sun, greatly will we reward you. And, because of your manhood, Atlantis shall make you a first noble and you shall enter the brotherhood of Cow." "You do us honor," said Morse. "But how may such things be accomplished? It seems to me we sit outside a barrier beyond which lies your kingdom and the fulfillment of your wishes toward us." Kiron laughed. "Truthfully," he said, "I had forgotten. On the third morning slaves will come to find what the vultures have left and cast the remains into the river, and then report that Kiron has been disposed of. We will stand aside until the way is open, and it shall be the slaves who are fed to the water. If you care not to soil your own hands, I will slay them with mine." He spoke with an arrogant confidence in his powers. "So we shall descend the pathway of the burned-out fires and come to Dor," he continued. "It will be a rare sight, the faces of my cousin Rana and of the high priest, are you. They will say nothing, for even Rana's people would not dare to seize me and would rise against her. A king of Atlantis may not be judged save by universal consent. You will do well to watch Rana's face, my brothers. It is as beautiful and yet as cruel as the flower of the long sleep that slays you as you bend to inhale its fragrant, deadly breath." "But where is this vase you speak of?" "It is across the canyon with the rest of our weapons and some of our supplies," said Laidlaw, sighing half out of weariness and half out of hunger. "We may cross the river by nightfall tomorrow," said Kiron. "I fear I have left you hungry, yet what is hunger compared with the gain of knowledge and of friendship? Let us sleep here on the ledge. Tomorrow we shall pass to your encampment and return to punish the dogs that Rana entrusted with her treachery." Morse spoke to Maya and Kolo and, without a word, they found a sleeping place and settled themselves for the night. The Americans and the Atlantean were soon to duplicate their example. They catnapped away a good part of the following day, with some time devoted to fruitless exploration. In the late afternoon the torrent had subsided sufficiently for them to cross the stream, wading and leaping from boulder to boulder, and to climb to the summit of the cliff. While Maya and Kolo prepared the meal that was so badly needed, Kiron examined the vase. "It is from the royal treasury," he said, "though the cover is of strange craftsmanship. See here the double axes of Minos and Pasiphae. I would like to meet the dog who stole it." "He is long since dust," said Morse, and he explained to Kiron the presence of the funereal ashes of Murdock within the vase and his intentions concerning their disposition. The idea caught the young king's imagination. "It is a worthy deed," he proclaimed. "It shall be carried out, and the name of your friend carven upon the walls of the temple along with your own. Have you not brought great news to Atlantis?" After the meal he examined with unconcealed wonder the rifles, the field glasses, compass, and chronometer, following intelligently the explanations of Laidlaw of their use and mechanism. The compass was new to him only in form. The flashlights excited his particular delight. "They are little suns," he exclaimed, "little suns that shall light us through the fire path." They recrossed the stream with little difficulty in the grey of early morning, relying on Kiron's assurance that the slaves could not reach the ledge before dawn. Carefully and quickly they disposed themselves close to the gate that led to a lost race. The sun rose behind the cliff, touching the plateau with a glorious golden color. The Indians were motionless statues on the stairway. Morse, Laidlaw, and Kiron stood quietly against the cliff on either side of the opening. Time passed slowly. Suddenly, without a sound, the great slab of basalt swung upon its pivot and ears strained for the footfalls that must follow. Out from the dark hole came the leader, advancing onto the ledge with the staff that proclaimed his authority held firmly in one hand. The silent watchers did not move. Now, 4 men appeared in the opening and their emergence became a signal for action. Silently, on the balls of their feet, the 3 attacked from behind. Morse felled the nearest with a single blow and Laidlaw's fist crashed down upon the back of another's skull. Both fell, blood gushing from the mouth of the one the scientist had hammered with his great fist. The headman sprang backward, whirling his staff in both hands as Kiron ran in upon him. The Atlantean ducked under the weapon and seized his opponent around the hips. Without apparent effort he raised him and heaved him over the cliff as if the powerful slave leader had been an inanimate bundle of little weight. One of the slaves fled down the staircase, only to meet the charging Indians. In an attempt to stop, he lost his footing and plunged into the gulf below. The last man fought furiously, but Laidlaw gained a gorilla-like embrace and quickly pushed his crumpled opponent away. Before they could interfere, Kiron had spurned one of the fallen slaves over the precipice. His fellows lay insensible. "We shall leave these carrion to the birds. Let your little sons shine," he said, "and I will lead you to Dor." Chapter 6. The Gates of Dor. For a little way the tunnel was dimly lit by the daylight that came through the opening. Kiron reached above his head and tugged at a bronze handle attached to a lever working in a slot of metal in the wall. A sound of falling water came to their ears, and the daylight faded as the gates behind them closed upon the outer world. "Hydraulic?" asked Laidlaw. "The lake has thrice risen and flooded the lower dwellings," said Kiron. "The engineers drove a causeway through the rock that follows this tunnel and empties into a great cleft we shall presently cross. The flood waters open doors automatically and carry off the waste. Meantime we use a small supply to open and close the gates and raise the bridge." Morse used only his flashlight, saving Laidlaw's and the extra batteries for an emergency. The power lens and reflector gave a brilliant light that was amply sufficient. The way led slightly upward through a shaft of volcanic origin. The flashlight revealed iridescent walls that occasionally changed in character, though always carrying the scars of ancient fires. At times great stalactites hung from the roof, and once they walked through a realm covered with the yellow prisms of sparkling sulfur crystals. The steamy air was laden with brimstone. Laidlaw, testing the water that trickled down the sides, hastily withdrew a blistered finger. To right and left, chambers and passages opened out. The floor had been roughly paved, and their progress was rapid. 10 minutes' travel brought them to the cleft which Kiron had spoken of. Here, the sound of rushing waters beneath them could be plainly heard. But the gap was almost entirely covered by a bridge of bronze cantilever construction. The heels of Morse and Laidlaw clanged on its metal, and Kiron, once across, pulled another handle. The bridge swung upward on silent hinges, completely blocking the passage and leaving a deep gulf in front of it. The tunnel showed increasing signs of man's work. Its steeper pitches had been made into series of low steps. At regular intervals along the sides, bronze brackets connected with an ornamental pipe that seemed to be designed for lighting. They are served from metal reservoirs at the far end which contain a gas that collects in the fissures of the mountain, explained Kiron. The control is at Dor, and they are only lit on special occasions. "There is volcanic fire also?" asked Laidlaw. "Dor is beneath the shadow of a great volcano in which lava simmers," answered Kiron. And in the temple, below the spot of sacrifice, is a deep shaft in which the fire of the altar of the gods always plays. Teli, the astrologer, whom you shall meet, will tell you that the wrath of the gods has not been manifested for more than 50 generations. Our traditions tell us that New Atlantis was born of fire and water, and by water and fire it shall be destroyed. Presently the tunnel became quadrangular with smooth walls and ceiling. Frescoes appeared, painted upon a plaster background with occasional bas-reliefs in the same material, showing rows of processional figures treated in the style of decorations found in the ruins of early Greece and Egypt. Before one of these Kiron halted while Morse turned his light upon the pictographs. They represented an enormous creature, seemingly as large as a hippopotamus in proportion to other figures. It stood erect on hind feet, balanced by a great tail, its sides covered with scaly armor. Parallel lines of servants and warriors in crested helmets, with broad-bladed swords, framed the monster. On one side was the giant form of a man with the head of a jaguar, holding a bow, the arrows from which bristled from the chest of a great beast. Above was a cartouche filled with hieroglyphics which Laidlaw translated. Here Pta the king, Pta the hunter, Pta the lord of all that breathes, killed the beast of the caves. Mighty is Pta. Laidlaw waved his hands excitedly. The beast is a Mylodon, one of the mammoth cave sloths of the Pleistocene and recent deposits. A fantastic find. Its skeleton and skin are in the Royal Museum, said Kiron. It is said that this was the last of its kind, but in the last 3 generations there have been reports that a great beast lives in the big caves at the southern end of the lake. What truth there is in this I do not know, but I have often meant to hunt it. If you wish, we will someday seek the beast together. Those death-giving tubes of yours should be more than a match for it, and you shall gain the wreath of victory. Realizing that the king was offering them an honor coveted by himself, Morse thanked him. Let us teach you the use of the tubes, and you shall not be outdone even by Pta himself. Kiron remained silent, but his expressive features could not hide the pleasure that came to his face. Abruptly, the tunnel turned to the right. They mounted a long flight of steps with daylight far above them. At the head of the staircase the way was closed with massive bronze gates, and beyond there loomed a beautifully paved terrace guarded by a balustrade of stone. Beyond this, traced against a cloudless sky, were the serrated summits of a volcanic ridge. A circular gong of bronze, 3 feet in diameter, hung close to the gates. Beneath it, in a wall niche, was a knobbed stick, the end thickly coated with rubber. Kiron picked it up and handed it to Laidlaw. "Strike, my brother," he said, "and strike your mightiest, that door may know a king knocks at its gates. But strike only once. Kings summon with one call, one stroke, one trumpet cry, and others knock and wait." Kiron's nakedness had been covered with a long strip of striped cloth from the American supplies. It was draped about him and belted to form a flowing skirt that fell halfway between knees and ankles, making a mantle that covered his shoulders and left his right arm bare. Kolo had made him a pair of sandals from broad forest leaves such as he himself wore. Morse, watching Laidlaw grasp the rubber knob, smiled to himself at his companion's soiled and stained khaki, the trousers tucked into high, laced boots, a dingy solar helmet upon his head. He became aware of his own disarray and wondered briefly how this lost people might regard their travel-worn appearance. Laidlaw swung his arm, and the rubber knob struck its target fair in the center. It tilted heavily at the ponderous blow, and the deep cry of its vibrations echoed in the tunnel and beat against their eardrums. The sound had not reached its height before a man in a short skirt and a jacket that resembled a bolero appeared. The surprise upon his face changed to consternation as he beheld Kiron and the strangers. For a moment he hesitated in apparent bewilderment. "Open," pronounced Kiron somberly. The man produced a curiously pronged key, inserted it in the lock, and turned it. As he pressed his foot upon a metal stud in the paving, the gates rolled noiselessly aside. The man groveled. "Pardon, O great king," he stammered. I had thought. Let it be your last one, said Kiron sternly. Thoughts can be dangerous at a time like this. Send quickly and bring us litters. It would be better, I think, he said, as the man disappeared at a run, if we go in closed litters to my wing in the palace. There we can attire ourselves fittingly. You will permit me to offer you clean linen? Morse accepted, pleased at the Atlanteans' delicacy. Give me a long robe, Kiron, said Laidlaw, that these legs of mine may not too early disgrace your standards. Would that mine bore a stouter body, replied Kiron. Then he continued, the rains are over, and this is the month of Minos, the festival month of the reappearance of the sun god. At noon, when he looks through the roof of his upper temple, the people will assemble and give thanks. Ayu will address them and doubtless Rana will as well. She may lament my absence, he added satirically. I shall be glad to be on hand to reassure her. By this time 3 litters of carved wood inlaid with carved ivory panels on which the double axe was conspicuous were at hand. Morse and Laidlaw climbed into 2 of these, and pulled close the silken curtains at Kiron's direction. The strong shoulders of the bearers took them along in comfort. Lying on his side, Morse could observe the lake through a crack in the curtains. Stretching toward purple hills, the water was dotted with islands. On the nearest one rose the white columns of a temple surrounded by trees. Boats with striped sails glided over the water. The lake seemed to occupy the bowl of a great crater. Its waters were strangely blue and placid, the blue of another world. Off in the distance came the distant sound of trumpets. A deep-throated chant echoed mournfully across the water. But no one was encountered, and the bearers' feet padded along tirelessly en route to their unknown destination. They entered a doorway and traversed a passage lined with white stone on which the double-axe sign was endlessly repeated. Finally, the litters were set down, and Morse and Laidlaw stepped out into a paved courtyard in the center of colonnades. Palms grew in great vases between the pillars. The bearers disappeared noiselessly. Kiron stood beside the edge of a pool in which a fountain splashed in the sun. Welcome to Dor, he greeted them. I will show you your apartments, my own slaves will attend you. He led them to a room of great size. The walls were frescoed in gesso duro, with unglazed window openings cased in bronze lattice, over which trailed flowering vines. Low couches and chairs shaped to the figure stood about. Through a doorway they caught an inviting glimpse of water in a pool. Kiron pointed to another door of paneled wood. There is your bath, he said. When you have bathed, will you join me in the pool? Morse gazed in astonishment at the lavatory fittings. Hot and cold water, he exclaimed. Silver fittings, ivory combs. And a mirror, no less. He surveyed himself disconsolately in a tall plate of polished metal. A nice pair of scarecrows we are, he said. Fine visitors for a palace. Look at this luxury, Laidlaw. You take it as if you had registered at the Ritz. I expected it, said Laidlaw. The Cretans were fully our equals in sanitary science. Thank the Lord for a bathtub. I wonder when we eat. You're impossible, laughed Morse. What do you think they'll serve us? Peacock and mullet, I suppose. I'm hungry myself. A series of light knocks sounded on the door. Come in, called Laidlaw. A pair of bronzed youths entered. One bore a ewer of gold in a deep bowl in which snow was closely packed with 2 goblets inserted bowl downward in the cool crystals. The other carried linen cloths and a cake of what might have been soap. They retired without uttering a word. Kiron's silent system, commented Laidlaw. I wish this soapweed cake were edible. What's in the pitcher? Asked Morse. Try it. Laidlaw poured the silver cups full of a ruby-colored liquor that smelled of spices and grapes. It was sweet, cloying to their palates, but none the less invigorating. After a hot bath, they crossed the main apartment to where Kiron awaited them. Without a word, the three moved simultaneously, diving into the inviting, emerald water and racing for the far end of the marble tank, 100 feet away. Just as the fingers of Morse and Kiron were outstretched to touch its side, Laidlaw, with a mighty surge, forged in ahead of them, the winner of the undeclared race. More youths awaited them as they emerged, dripping, clad them in loose linen wraps, and escorted them to couches. There they were massaged with sweet scented oils. A servant brought a pile of garments, dividing them into 3 groups. The youths assisted Morse and Laidlaw to invest themselves in the strange attire, after one had passed a comb through Laidlaw's tawny hair and beard, to his passive disgust. Kiron and Morse were shaved quickly and smoothly by attendants with wedge-shaped razors that were as well-tempered as any American product. Laidlaw was garbed in a pleated skirt of dull red that fell to his insteps and was bordered with a fringe of gold. His misshapen dwarf legs were well concealed. A golden girdle, scaled and flexible as a snake's skin, held it in place. Above was a tunic of fine wool, purple in hue, the left arm short-sleeved and the right bare, showing Laidlaw's Herculean proportions to their full advantage. Gilded sandals, bound with thongs of soft leather, and a fillet of the same material about his brows completed the costume. Like some lord of ancient Assyria, he walked the length of the pool, squaring his shoulders before the critical eyes of Kiron. Morse wore a double chiton of white wool, sleeveless, caught at the shoulders with gold fibulae brooches, and belted with vermilion leather encrusted with gold filigree set with pale green arlevines. The skirt of this singular garment touched his knees, and its cloth was bordered with golden brocade. His sandals were scarlet, his garb almost a duplicate of Kiron's. Morse enjoyed the freedom and coolness of the costume, and his naturalness brought an exclamation from Laidlaw. "You look like an Atlantean to me, Morse." The discarded clothing lay on one of the couches of the main apartment when they entered. Kiron showed them a space in the wall, masked so cunningly by a part of the design that the uninitiated eye would never suspect its existence. In it they stowed their goods, and Kiron revealed the secret of its opening by pressing the paneled eye of a big cat creeping over ivy-covered rocks and about to spring upon a pheasant-like bird. "Now," said the Atlantean, "let us eat. We have an hour before the middle day." Laidlaw did not try to suppress a sigh of pleasure. In the courtyard, a trestle table and seats had been arranged. Glossy leaves bearing red waxen flowers were entwined between goblets and platters of gold on a white cloth. The peacocks of Morse's imagination did not make an appearance, but the mullets were typified by a lake fish of delicate flesh, served in a sauce of thyme and cucumber. This was followed by a pudding of meal, surrounded by a number of enormous frogs' legs. A sweet pudding filled with chopped fruits ended the repast, at which time even Laidlaw attempted to loosen the links of his girdle. There were litters in attendance, and the 3 were borne from the palace behind silken curtains. When they halted in a paved alley between high walls, Kiron dismissed the bearers and led the way to an entrance barely the height of Morse. The Atlantean struck his foot upon a disc of metal that protruded slightly from the threshold, and the bronze gateway slid into the wall. 50 steps stretched down to a corridor leading to a blank wall. A flower of bronze, hollow-centered, projected from a stone slab. Kiron advanced and spoke into the petals. Immediately there was a light sound of clicking. A section of the wall descended into the floor. Kiron turned his head to Laidlaw. "We, too, have our inventions," he said proudly as they passed through the opening. "This is a hidden entrance to the temple." A long incline appeared before them, rising to the antechamber of a great hall, and ending in a high screen woven from golden threads into a weird design of foliage and fruit. The workmanship was so fine that the light pierced it, and through it came the sound of a high, querulous voice. "That is are you," said Kiron, anger rising in him. A blare of trumpets followed, a burst of voices in a swelling harmony. A strange incense penetrated the antechamber. A woman's deep contralto, ineffably sweet and alluring, reached them. Re has removed the veil from his face and smiles once more. Great is Re. The blossoms are invested with his breath and speak of golden fruit. The land sends up incense. The hearts of youth listen to the mating cries of the birds and are glad. Atlantis smiles beneath the glory of Re that now descends upon us. And now a chant sounded. His glory descending, our hearts fill with pleasure, our voices ascending in manifold measure proclaim adoration, the joy of a nation to greet thee, O Re. 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 Giver of light and life. Our hearts with joy are rife, hear us, O Re. Beyond the screen, the hall was suddenly flooded with a golden glow. Presently the woman's voice broke the silence. The golden flower opens. Lo, our prayers are acceptable. Gladness shall come to Atlantis, and fertility. Yet there is a shadow upon the radiance that showers down. Kiron, our king, beloved of Re, is missing from the festival, absent from this gathering. A cry arose of Kiron. Kiron. But Kiron did not move, and a sardonic smile crossed his face. Wait. Rana has not yet ended. You call for Kiron, and he answers not, said the queen. Some grave misfortune must have befallen him. The oracles are silent, though Ayu, your spirit lord, has besought them. The holy fire smoldered sullenly at his questioning. Kiron. Where is Kiron? Called a voice, quaveringly. Has he lost favor with the gods? I cannot answer you, my people, said Rana. Like you, I can only ask, where is Kiron? Here. Beckoning Morse and Laidlaw to follow, Kiron strode around the screen. Bearded priests in flowing robes encircled a platform. A slender woman stood before a throne of gold that glittered with gems. Beside it, a second royal chair was empty. The emblem of the double axe, gleaming blades on ebony staffs, loomed between them. From an opening in the roof, a shaft of sunshine poured in. Beyond it the Americans vaguely glimpsed a multitude of shifting forms. Here, repeated Kiron, one arm upraised, advancing until he stood in the center of the dancing motes of sunray. Kiron is here, and unto Re the sun god gives his salutation. A cheer from 1,000 throats echoed from roofs and walls. Morse saw Rana shrink back, terror in her eyes. A priest whose robes were heavy with brocade down which his long beard broke in a silver shower stepped to her side and whispered. She straightened her slim length and advanced to the edge of the dais. Her eyes were transformed into crimson orbs of hate, which she quickly masked with lowered eyelids. Zeus be praised, she said. Kiron, chosen of Re, Rana the queen rejoices with our people. She extended a hand that was like a white flower. Kiron chose to ignore it and ascended the platform as the people roared their approval. People of Atlantis, he began, I bring to you my brothers, strangers who are not strange, visitors who bring tidings from the remote past, of Minos, king of kings, bearers of great news. See, Re shines on them and hails them as his own. The shifting shaft of sunbeam had enveloped Morse and Laidlaw where they stood. Disperse to the feasting and the dance, said Kiron. Presently Ayu, high priest of Minos and of Re, shall address you. We would be alone with our new brothers. Morse and Laidlaw felt the challenge of keen glances. Morse found the gaze of Rana directed at him with an admiration that she made no attempt to hide. Laidlaw's amber eyes encountered another kind of look. For there was both challenge and threat centered in the narrow look of Ayu. As the crowd departed, Kiron addressed himself to Rana. The vultures feed on the carrion you sent to give them daintier food. Are you not glad to greet me, cousin? You speak in strange riddles, Kiron, she answered softly in a voice that held the magic of united strings. Truthfully, I am glad to see you. Present me to your brothers. Chapter 7. The Queen advances. After his one speech to Rana in which he acknowledged her treachery, Kiron, strangely, made no further mention of it. To Morse's astonishment, he spoke to his cousin in a cordial and open manner, as if the subject were forgotten. Kiron occupied his throne, settled himself naturally, and directed Laidlaw to relate his story to the ring of priests. Rana, in the meantime, had beckoned Morse to her side with a slight motion and a strange magnetic look in her deep and unfathomable eyes. In spite of his knowledge, and he could not shake the picture of Kiron lying bound upon the ledge as food for the vultures, he felt an attraction to this beautiful woman. He fought it wonderingly. Rana was beautiful by any standards, and her manner was an entrancing combination of swiftly changing vivacity and languor. Insensibly Morse began to place much of the blame of her actions upon Ru, who made no attempt to hide his antipathy for the strangers, even as he acknowledged the wonder of Laidlaw's story. The ring of priests stood wide-eyed as Laidlaw told of the discovery of the cup, and showed keen interest in his account of the island of Crete and its history. There was unbridled enthusiasm at the disclosure of a living race who were at least remotely related to them. And there was wonder and disbelief as Laidlaw promised to display a collection of photographs of Greek art and architecture, the American describing as simply as he could the nature of a sun picture. Ru listened with a scowl deepening on his brows, alternately watching Laidlaw and Morse, or noting the satirical smile that continually played across the face of Kiron. Rana plied Morse with 1,000 questions, and her expressive eyes and red, pouting lips were a magnet to him. Were there many men like him in his own land? Yes. He was surely too modest. In Atlantis such a man might aspire to anything, even a throne. Morse, in almost a hypnotic trance, tried to affect an ignorance of her plain speaking. She halted and appraised him, a trace of puzzlement on her brow. And all at once the vivacity flamed again. She covered him with a flattery that made no attempt to hide her delight in his person. She praised his Greek and promised to be his personal tutor of Atlantean idioms. She outlined a tour with a score of things to see with her as guide. And she made it clear that any attempt to include Laidlaw would prove distasteful to her. "Let him prate to the priests," she said. "He is old and I do not like his legs." Evidently her keen eyes had judged their hidden proportions, despite the long robes. "His face is hairy, and he is a musty creature. Knowledge is for age, when the joys of manhood are mere fruit husks. Let us not waste our time upon rinds when the luscious pulp is before us." At last Laidlaw was finished, but there was further talk with the priests. There were games in the afternoon, and what better time was there that Ru might present the strangers to the people? "He can sit in the priests' benches," said Rana, indicating Laidlaw. "You shall sit with me." Somehow, the imperiousness, the totality of her manner began to penetrate his consciousness, and beyond the outwardly beautiful shell he began to see her more clearly. Morse began to wonder what her purpose was in showering him with attention. He was limp and perspiring when he left her spell, aware that he had been fighting with himself for nothing more than his own right to think, aware of her beauty and her magnetism, and suddenly and vividly aware of how Kiron had been tied and left to die at her command. He shuddered. Laidlaw was full of talk and excitement. He was in his element. He had talked past a meal and had not even missed it. Now that the great archaeologist had a few minutes apart from this hidden people, he could not silence his hoarse voice. And while he had been addressing Morse all along, he suddenly realized that his fellow American was there. "The Queen is a beautiful woman," he began, a question in his voice. "She is that," replied Morse unfeelingly. "Remember Kiron," admonished Laidlaw, for once laconic. Morse nodded slowly, and was silent for a time. "There is something about her," he said at last, searching carefully for words. When she was near me, it was almost as if that part of me that knew what she had done was blocked out. There was something powerful about her. She is powerful. Ayu is powerful, too, said Laidlaw. He hates us, and someday he means to fill a throne. If that day comes. Laidlaw stopped and drew a finger across his throat suggestively. Then he continued. The old struggle between church and state is here. And the Atlantean priesthood is losing its grip. The people are over-civilized, too sophisticated. They demand to be amused, and the theologians are unable to satisfy them. Ayu recognizes this and realizes that his only way of retaining power is to seize the throne. Oh, I found out a few things, said Laidlaw. Didn't talk all of the time. Kiron is a cultured aristocrat, the kind out of style in most of the world. He was born to privileges that he will not give up lightly. Rana is a woman. One thing only dominates her: sex. It is her weapon, her armor, her delight, the one thing that Ayu plays upon. He has her convinced that Kiron's indifference is scorn, and she hates him. Ayu has no love for either of us, but he fears you because you could become a permanent fixture if Rana can dominate you. Morse looked at him quizzically. You seem to have a keen insight into the ways of women. I risk myself in that kind of labyrinth. Laidlaw laughed, but there was a touch of bitterness in his voice. Morse wondered whether there was a claw mark somewhere that had not entirely healed. Rana, summed up the scientist, has been spoiled by adulation. As princess and queen, she has been accustomed to cry for the moon and keep on crying until she got it. Now that she's in power, she is incorrigible. Don't you believe in suffrage, Laidlaw? Suffrage and sex, the fair sex, don't make a team. Over there, he pointed to the island they had seen from the litter where the Karlam temple rose from its setting of tropical verdure, is the home of Atlantean suffrage minus sex. It is the island of Seal, inhabited by a cult of women who have deliberately subordinated sex to the pursuit of knowledge and power. Their leader is none other than Rana's sister, Leola, who is said to be more beautiful than Rana herself. But Rana is not jealous. Leola abjures mankind. She is the high priestess of Pasiphae, the moon goddess, sharer of the double axe. Morse looked at the island with curiosity. An island of beautiful virgins who had deliberately chosen to challenge men's prerogatives was intriguing to him. Only the priesthood is allowed to land there, said Laidlaw, interpreting his friend's glance. Ayu and his followers are also celibates. I don't imagine that Leola and her followers are overpopular. The population of Atlantis is on the wane. Do you think they have any chance of achieving their ambitions? Asked Morse. To become the equal of man? I doubt it. Mentally and physically they are handicapped by the sex instinct. It would take many generations to overcome that, and by their own laws future generations are impossible. They can only add to their numbers by fresh recruits who are largely influenced by the chance of becoming more or less conspicuous. The priestesses of Pasiphae are very important at festival functions. If you had been Adam, the world would never have been populated, laughed Morse. Eve would have had a lonely time of it. It is because there is some of the old Adam in me that I am on my guard, replied Laidlaw to his friend's astonishment. I am not a bachelor from choice, Morse. I am as human as you are. I'm afraid that you met the wrong woman once, thought Morse, but he did not speak his thoughts. Instead, he asked, did you notice that the lake water is noticeably warm? The priests mentioned it, Laidlaw replied. They say it is a recurrent phenomena that precedes activity in the volcano, and they are rather glad of it. I imagine it gives them an opportunity to renew their grip on the credulity of the people by ceremonials. They can magnify their own importance and supposedly ward off the calamity by appeasing the wrath of the gods.